Now we'll turn to gas transport. That is, how are oxygen gas and carbon dioxide gas transported in the bloodstream? So for oxygen, it's actually just a little bit of review from where we talked about blood earlier in the semester. Molecular oxygen, which means O2, not just O, is transported in the blood primarily 98 to 99% on hemoglobin, or attached to the heme part of the hemoglobin molecule, the iron part. About 1 to 2% of that is dissolved as gas bubbles in the plasma of blood. A couple of vocabulary terms: oxyhemoglobin and deoxyhemoglobin, or reduced hemoglobin, which is hemoglobin that's lost some oxygen or released oxygen. Now in this equation, this hydrogen ion might give you a little concern, because you'll remember that acidity of a solution is based on free hydrogen ions. But this hydrogen ion that is released when oxygen binds to hemoglobin will be buffered, as we'll see later. So there's a few factors that are really important in determining hemoglobin unloading, or what's also called oxygen saturation or hemoglobin saturation. Hemoglobin unloading means that hemoglobin is releasing oxygen from heme. Hemoglobin saturation refers to how much oxygen is bound to the heme. So it's two ways of really saying the same thing, which is how much oxygen is actually on hemoglobin. So these factors regarding gas transport are controlled locally in many cases. So as the partial pressure, that's the PO2, of oxygen in a particular area goes down, you will unload or give up more oxygen to those tissues, because that says that they're actually using oxygen. As blood pH goes down, you will also unload more oxygen to those tissues. The same thing is true, or actually for PCO2. As PCO2, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, increases, you will also unload more oxygen to those tissues. So if you think about how and why oxygen gas and CO2 are produced and used, so let's take a look at the logic of those two statements. So if you go back and consider aerobic respiration that takes place in the mitochondrion of the cell, we use glucose and oxygen gas to yield carbon dioxide, water, and 36 to 38 ATPs. So if a cell is actively working, and let's use muscle cells as an example, if you're working out and those muscles are actively working and making ATP, they're using up the oxygen, so the PO2 locally will go down, and they're generating or making PCO2, so the partial pressure of CO2 goes up. So in both of those cases, that active tissue needs more oxygen. Now the same is actually true if you consider temperature. The warmer the tissue, the harder it's working. Remember that heat is a byproduct of chemical reactions in the body as well. So the more the increase in temperature tells you that that tissue is working hard, using oxygen, generating more CO2. So you need to increase oxygen unloading or hemoglobin unloading in that particular area. Now, BPG is a chemical that is generated by red blood cells when they do anaerobic respiration. Remember, a mature red blood cell is a biconcave anucleate disc that has very few organelles, because its job is to carry hemoglobin and hence oxygen. So as that red blood cell is performing anaerobic respiration, it's generating this chemical BPG, and you can look up what BPG stands for in your textbook. So the more BPG there is, the more hemoglobin unloading there is. And this is something that your textbook may not tell you, but kind of an interesting fact about BPG that will also help you remember why it's important, is that BPG also helps prevent the oxygen that's unloading from reattaching itself to hemoglobin. So BPG keeps the red blood cell from undoing the good work it's doing by unloading oxygen. Now the Bohr effect and the Haldane effect are really the same, essentially, but looked at from two different angles. Both of these effects are ones that increase oxygen unloading to tissues, but they look at it from different perspectives. So the Bohr effect says that the hemoglobin-oxygen bond is weakened where more oxygen is required. So where you need to unload more oxygen, the bond between hemoglobin and oxygen is weakened because of the increase in PCO2 and a decrease in blood pH. The Haldane effect says the same thing, that oxygen unloading is increased, but it looks at it from the perspective of CO2 that's transported within the red blood cell. And this one says that the more CO2 that's bound to hemoglobin, and the average normal is about 20%, so the closer that number gets to 20%, the more hydrogen ion is bound to hemoglobin, and the more O2 can be unloaded.